Past year have been painful and brought the issue of race to the forefront in this country. So many times in the past we have thought race relations would get better, but recently we found ourselves experiencing some of the ugliest examples of racism in recent years.
And right here at WJZ, we wanted to have a talk about race and how we seize this moment in time to make things better and have the uncomfortable conversations about institutionalized racism that need to happen so we can really show progress and get to the reality so many of us desperately want to live. And we brought together members of our community who have different perspectives on where we go from here.
Adam Jackson is the CEO of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle and has spent decades lobbying in Annapolis for police reform and programs to help young people of color. John Wesley is the public information officer for the city's Office of Civil Rights. He's been a key player in Baltimore's rich civil rights history. Bishop Antonio Palmer is with the United Black Clergy of Anne Arundel County. And
retired Sergeant James Spearman worked in the Annapolis Police Department for 33 years. Erica Austin, the CEO for her company, Access Granted. Now, many remember her as a driving force behind the Children's Place right in the Penn North neighborhood where Freddie Gray lived and died. She has dedicated her life to the future of our young people, and it is hard to argue that anyone knows the youth of Baltimore better than Erica.
Tonight, we look at how we make sure that this time things really do change. Many people hope that after the death of Freddie Gray in police custody back in 2015, Baltimore would see significant change and improvement in the black community, and that police and the people they serve would forge a new, more positive relationship. Take us back, each of you, to that day and tell us, how were you feeling then and how do you feel now?
It's devastating, and it almost brought back what happened in the 60s, what happened in the 70s. Is it going to continue to happen? What can we do? All those thoughts were racing in my heart and mind.
Someone should do something about that, and I waited, and no one did. So as a direct result of what happened and who I am as a woman, I protected our babies. And that was the most important thing to me. So some 6 years later, those kids are, young adults, riding through. Miss Erica, they're still on the corner. Those who've survived.
My heart broke for the officers who were being assaulted, who had nothing to do with what occurred to Freddie Gray. I was also going through a lot of mixed emotions because these officers forgot their training, and they made it hard for the rest of the police officers who go out and do their job every day, who had nothing to do with it, and they had to bear the brunt and pay the price.
Adam Jackson, you have told me before that the series of events that took place 6 years ago is something you will never forget. Us sitting in this room right now, having this discussion, what's going through your mind?
As I think about it, back in 2015, a lot of my work at the time was around addressing these issues around police reform and police accountability. And you could not get the state legislature to pass legislation around that issue, even after the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And so there were all these conversations happening in 2014 before Freddie Gray was killed. But even now, as we see here in 2021, in this current state legislature, we're still having the same debates. The governor supporting tough on crime legislation. There's all these conversations that we still have to have, even though there's overwhelming evidence that we can't even get we need the baseline. We need to have civilian oversight of law enforcement. We need to have direct investment in black institutions. We need to destabilize structural racism. But those things, the rhetoric has changed around a lot of these issues, but the policy and the money hasn't followed.
You had a gap between policy and practice. It was the policy of the police department that when you arrest someone and you put them in a paddy wagon, that you put restraints on them. It was not the practice stuff. So, and that is one of the things that is one of the lasting legacies of this, that finally we are beginning to, in Baltimore in particular, look at the difference between policy and practice, and using equity as a measuring tool. We're now, with the Office of Equity and Civil Rights, beginning to approach how do we increase the level of equity.
We've got George Floyd, we have Freddie Gray, we have the insurrection at the Capitol, we're at Charlottesville, Virginia. Answer this question for me. As a black person, I feel.
As a black person, I feel like I'm on the edge. As a faith leader, always look at history. Our country was founded, it's a belief system that allows systemic racism to continue.
When I first observed the video, this might sound sick, but I said finally. And the reason why I said finally is because there were so many officers who committed similar acts, who got away with it because there was that, oh, well, maybe you didn't see this, or maybe it wasn't that, or you don't know what the person was doing. The officer was afraid. He had to do what he had to do. This video showed you from beginning to end. For 9 minutes and almost 30 seconds, you could see from beginning to end how George Floyd was treated. You got to see from beginning to end how he was treated over a counterfeit $20 bill. This is the reason why so many people are saying Black Lives Matter.
You're a former police officer.
Yes, sir.
If you get pulled over tonight, will you be concerned for your safety?
I've been pulled over, and I've always been concerned with my safety. I turn the light on the interior, and I put both my hands on top of the steering wheel, and I wait, just like everybody else. Just like everybody else. Because when I take that uniform off, I'm a black man. I can't educate my way out of racism. I can't professionalize my way out of racism.
When we talk about race, I often think about the youth of Baltimore and what they're going through. Erica, I look at you directly because we have walked the streets together many, many times, and you will be hard-pressed to find someone in Baltimore City who knows the youth better than you do. What are the kids saying to you right now? And I know one of the things that you have said to me many times is our youth of Baltimore is being set up for failure because not enough is being done.
My most heartbreaking experience comes from asking a young person, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Grow up? I'm trying to make it to tomorrow. You know, that's our reality. Our young people are hopeless. There is no evidence around them that outside of those that live in their home, that someone cares about them. I mean, they're in a school system designed to fail. They're intentionally and strategically placed in this pipeline to prison. When they walk outside of their doors, there are vacant buildings and unemployed and underemployed people everywhere. There is no investment that says, you know, graduate from high school, go to college, get a career that's believable. Our young people need to be seen, heard, respected, and invested in.
As a black man in America right now, given the current climate, how do you feel?
Motivated, because black people need power. You know, black people we've been saying consistently across the country that we don't need charity. We don't need people to empathize. I could care less how people feel about what's going on with black people. We need power. We need investment. And that to me has been the crucial component, because I feel a lot of things as a black person on the daily basis about you know, what's going on, like, you know, race. You know, you feel anxious, you feel sad, you feel depressed, you go in and out of emotions because you're black in America. But right now, how I feel is motivated, because I think that we are in a very crucial time in our country's history where we can take people from having conversations to actually organizing for power. And power is something that people have not seen. When you've never seen it, you don't know how to attain it.
Many black individuals, friends of mine, who had said some of the racism that they've encountered are from individuals who were raised that way, and it was put into their heads as a young child, and that's the way they were brought up. What can be done to change that?
I believe our youth are having enough of it. And I've seen it where the youth are challenging the status quo. They're challenging our old traditions and our way of thinking. They're standing up and saying, you know, this isn't right.
Many people today believe police reform is at the heart of improving race relations with the community. Now, we all remember after the death of Freddie Gray, the Justice Department issued a consent decree that required a review of the practices and policies of the police department. Now, it has been a slow process that is still many years later ongoing, but it has uncovered police corruption. Today, there's a civilian review board that weighs in on investigations into police misconduct. It can offer recommendations, but has no real authority. But in trying to fix what's wrong, many officers feel that these high-profile cases demonstrating police brutality have tainted the reputation of every good officer out there.
Police officers forget that when you take somebody into custody, you're taking their freedom away. Not only are you taking their freedom away, that means you're responsible for them. So they didn't follow their training and they didn't do their job. And just like everyone else has said, millions of dollars of damage in the city. Things are still the same way. But the other thing that affected me, it made me realize the divide between the community and law enforcement.
One of the things I can appreciate about the current context that we're in is that the conversations have definitely changed. And from being that there is no problem, that we're in a post-racial society, I can appreciate that. But the problem is that we need our legislators and we need civic leaders to follow that with resources. And in Baltimore, our biggest problem is that we aren't investing in community-based institutions. People talk about violence in the black community, and the solution many times is to throw more money at the police department. But the problem is we have organizations in community like Safe Streets, Baltimore Ceasefire, and a bevy of other organizations that could address communal violence. But we're not investing in them, we're investing in the police department. We're investing in tough on crime. And if we don't do that, then we can't see the needle move, especially as it relates to public safety, because that's the solution, is to invest in the community.
When the trial was about to happen, having to bring in Baltimore's top attorneys to educate the young people on the legal jargon, the full description of charges, so that our young people could understand and operate from information versus emotion, because we knew there wouldn't be a conviction. It's that, preparing kids for injustice. Our young people are hopeless. Our young people don't trust. $5 million, $1 million over 5 years, the recast grant came into Sandtown, Winchester as a result of the uprising. And it was the first grant that was going to be community driven. And all these community meetings were held, and this promise that the community would speak, say what they wanted, get the resources that were needed for mainly the young people in the community. And healing circles were funded. Drum circles were funded. Yoga and programming that I am certain, when knocks on the door, like, what do you need in Sandtown, Winchester? What do you need? I doubt that anyone ever said, I need a healing circle. So it's the blatant ignoring and disregard of a people who know what they need, can even articulate like what their solutions, but there's no one listening. Because evidence-based programming, the dollars follow evidence-based program. There's some evidence that healing circles heal communities of color. That's some researchers with some good words, with some good technology.
White privilege and systemic racism is there because, and I always try to challenge the white pastor, because to me, the greatest influencer in our country is the white pastor, because he may have multitudes of white people that are in his congregation that voted for Trump, and knowing goodness well how Trump is and his views concerning black people, and so that white pastor can actually stand up finally and say something. What would Jesus do? Say what Jesus would have done. But if you don't believe that Jesus had melanin in his skin, and that you believe that everybody else that look like me are cursed people, then you're going to continue in your privilege. You're going to continue to allow injustices to take place and be silent about it, you're going to continue to allow a police officer to commit brutality and fatality and so forth without saying a word. And your congregations of thousands of white folks are going to follow suit. But if you lift up your voice, if a Franklin Graham, who has a national platform, would stand beside a T.D. Jakes and said, together we fight, and together we had enough of this, it'll start turning around. That's just the misconception again. I believe it's from a belief system. I'm going to say it until I start to see change.
If there are 3 officers involved in a shooting incident, one officer hits the person they're firing at. We can talk to the 2 officers who were witnesses, but not to the officer who fired the shot. I mean, because he is protected. Okay? Now, when you look at that in terms of Baltimore City and the need to redo community policing, okay, we have to find a way to help the officers. The community has to find a way to help these officers spend more time in these communities when they are not there for enforcement. You know, we expect them for enforcement, but we don't expect them to do those things like, you know, I used to speak at schools and I'd ask kids, what do you want to be? When the officer-friendly programs are out there, inadvertently, all of the boys said, I want to be a fireman, I want to be a policeman. That is no longer their answer.
No.
Nobody wants to be a policeman.
Nobody wants to be a policeman. I think that speaks volumes.
Of what it means to really have a law enforcement agency that meets the needs of the community,
yes.
That is the missing component.
Yes.
And every piece of sociological evidence that talks about what it means to have a police department that's accountable says you need to have civilian oversight. Maryland's biggest problem is that has been missing. Even right now in the state legislature, we've been talking about repealing the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights because we believe that law enforcement should be treated like other civil service employees. And we know that if you have civilian oversight, that means that police officers, who engage regularly in misconduct, it's not in the current process. They're being adjudicated by other law enforcement officials. But if they know that the broader community has access to the information, then that means they're more than likely going to stop the behavior. And that's the part you can intervene in. But the problem is in Maryland, that's not been the culture. Even the Fraternal Order of Police, when they wrote a book about it in the 60s or the 70s, I believe, they talked about how black people were organizing against law enforcement organizations, and people were coming out saying we need to have civilian oversight. And so the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights was codified in 1974. I think there are 14 other states around the United States that have a LEOBR, and that was the point, was to stop civilian oversight. And we've seen the ravages of it. You've seen the consent decree. The consent decree of 2016 talked about how there were all this rampant pattern of practice of racism. There's the Gun Trace Task Force that had rampant corruption, abuse of black people, planting evidence, and the thing is, in other jurisdictions, Anne Arundel County, Montgomery County, if there was a Gun Trace Task Force in that area, how would any of us know? Because there's no oversight. And that's a part of the problem. And with the Civilian Review Board here in Baltimore, that's been the consistent problem, is that we haven't been able to empower that board to actually hold police accountable, to fire officers, to suggest it, not because it can only suggest discipline, but we can't actually make that happen without giving it the teeth to do so. That's been the consistent back and forth. Derek Chauvin trial, I think, demonstrates that, is that we have to have a good chief, a good mayor, a good elected officials who agree with us. But if the residents or the civilians are controlling the process, that's the definition of power. And that's what's been kept out of our reach for so long. And I think right now, we're at a pivotal moment. We can choose that pathway, or we can choose what we've already been doing for the past 50, 60 years.
And one of the things that I always say is that no law enforcement agency, no matter how good they are, if they don't have the support and the trust of the people, they're just an occupying force and nothing ever gets done. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in the community, but there's also a lot of work that needs to be done within law enforcement.
So it was very important for me that young people built relationships with police officers in a way that made them human.
Yes.
In a way that police officers could interact with young black males in a way where they weren't being accused of a crime, that they weren't the perpetrators, that they were a little boy playing Madden. And when you know Tay-Tay's name,
Yes.
and when Tay-Tay knows Officer RJ, and RJ sees Tay-Tay in the middle of the day, and he can say, Tay-Tay, why aren't you in school?
Yes.
And Tay-Tay can now trust this officer to say, our lights were off.
Yes.
You know, I'm at the store with my mom because we didn't have breakfast.
Yes.
And RJ can buy a breakfast sandwich.
I've done that.
That changes the demographics. That changes relationships.
Be willing to correct the wrong.
The avenue has changed very little since 2015. The kinds of things that you saw then, you see now. And I know how we worked on grants for the area. You know, I worked on a $100,000 grant and the application for the $750,000 grant. I brought the Main Street program back to the avenue where we were looking forward to what the businesses were going to be able to do. But finally, until we deal with the white ale and the black butterfly, as Norris Jones talks about it, until we really deal with that from an equity standpoint, and I come back to that, we will continue to see this kind of stuff in this city. And we have to work now. We don't have a lot of time left before all hope is lost.
Maryland is uniquely positioned in the mid-Atlantic. Washington, D.C. is right down the street, and we're below the Mason-Dixon line. The impression outside of Maryland is that race relations here are good. True or false?
False.
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 While many people believe that racism has at times seemed worse than ever in recent years, our panel finds reasons for hope and change.
Our last presidential administration gave people that don't look like us this false sense of courage to subtly and blatantly show their disregard and hatred towards people that look like me in a way that hasn't been seen since before I was born. Like, you could blatantly display your disdain for me because I'm black.
They can begin to spend more time on the most segregated day of the week, on Sundays, with congregations that are mixed, predominantly African American. What do we worship? Why do we do it that way? What are the things that we are asking for? What are the things we are praying for? What are the things we are singing about? And if they spent time doing this, and in addition to that, if we look at things like the history of Baltimore, at the turn of the century, the 1900s, the largest number of freedmen in America were in Baltimore. Most of what we did in the civil rights movement nationwide started here in Baltimore, and then we adopted those things. When the first March on Washington was going to happen, about 1941, and the president found out that Baltimore was sending all those buses and all that money, he changed the federal rules allowing blacks to get contracts with the federal government because Baltimore was just that powerful. So I want to see Baltimore return to that. You know, we have so many models to follow. Walter P. Carter, when I look at Upton alone, Enola Macmillan, Parent Mitchell, and I find it very interesting, and I'll end by saying this, that we don't hear their names enough. We don't even talk about the names of the people who contributed so much to laying the foundation for us to do whatever it is we want to do. And that is very painful to me still.
When people know your name, when people know who you are, they're more likely to talk to you. In the area that I patrolled before I retired, the kids called me Uncle Jimmy, and the kids this young man's age called me Mr. Jimmy, and then the older people called me whatever they felt like calling me. But so at the end of the day, you know, you have to build those relationships with people. We have to learn how to interact with people, treat people like they're people.
It's just that when you have a structural problem, it requires and necessitates a structural response. And that takes time, because we've gotten the opposite for many years. And Baltimore is a city that has suffered from systemic disinvestment over decades and generations. And I think that what people want to see, like for me, it'd be great to go down to Penn North and to see all the buildings renovated and to see people happy and safe. But that's a result. The conditions of Sandtown, Winchester, and Pennsylvania Avenue and the neighborhoods around it, and a lot of poor and working class black communities, is because they've never gotten the resources to change the conditions of their community. And that's been the problem pretty consistently. And I'll give two examples of things that are happening now. On the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor, I believe 2 years ago, it was designated as an arts and entertainment district. It's the first one in Maryland, and I think probably the first one of its kind in the country. And there's people that are working to make sure that that area of Baltimore transforms. And people want it to happen quickly, because people want, like, yeah, we want a new building, we want new buildings, we want new housing stock, we want new schools, we want all these things to happen quickly. But it's difficult to make things happen when you're up against structural racism. A second example I would give would be the Baltimore Children and Youth Fund. That's something that came directly out of the uprising. And what people don't know about the Youth Fund is that even though it's publicly funded, it's an independent entity led by people of community. Yeah. And the year that it gave out resources, it went to, I think 3/4 of the money went to local black organizations that never got money before. And at the moment, we're working to build it out, to make it more, to develop the process so that way we don't work like how philanthropy works.
Baltimore isn't where we were, and we're certainly not where we're going. So for anyone who watched this thinking that we hadn't made any progress, we have. Baby steps, but progress. And those who thought, we have nowhere else to go, we do. So I think there's some optimism for those who may have been very pessimistic when this conversation started.
And WJZ will continue to examine the state of race in Maryland, because we are committed to talking about what matters, even when it's hard. Now, you can find this program and more of our conversation on our website. Just head over to WJZ.com.
We want to work with all of you to be part of the solution. Thanks for joining us.